EVO. There are sounds that our time as human beings has taught us to welcome. The ringing of a telephone usually carries news from someone we know. The bark of a neighbor's dog reassures us that ordinary life continues beyond our walls. Footsteps on a sidewalk, the rumble of passing traffic, children laughing in a nearby park. All of these become part of the comforting soundtrack of everyday existence because they remind us that we're surrounded by other people living ordinary lives. Then there's the knock at the door. No other sound asks so much of the human imagination. A knock immediately demands interpretation. Friends knock, delivery drivers knock, police officers knock, neighbors knock to borrow tools or to introduce themselves, or to warn us about maybe a loose dog wandering through the neighborhood. Throughout history, the simple act of answering a door has represented one of civilization's quietest acts of faith. Every time we reach for the handle, we're making a small decision that the person standing outside probably means us no harm. And that assumption has always fascinated storytellers. Greek mythology filled thresholds with gods disguised as weary travelers, rewarding those generous enough to offer hospitality while punishing those who refused. Medieval Europe imagined witches seeking shelter before revealing their true nature. Vampire legends insisted that even the most terrifying predator required permission before crossing the threshold into a home. Across cultures separated by centuries and continents, doors became something more than just entrances. They represented the boundary between safety and uncertainty, between the known world and everything waiting patiently beyond it. And maybe that's why so many accounts of the black-eyed children begin the same way. There's no screams, there's no violence, there's no pursuit. There's simply a knock at the door. Welcome back to The Devil Within. This is The New Monsters, our latest installment. This is episode 2 of The Black-Eyed Children. This episode's called The Children at the Door. So last week we traced the remarkable origins of the black-eyed children phenomenon to journalist Brian Bethel's now famous encounter in Abilene, Texas during the winter of 1996. We explored why his account resonated so deeply with readers and discovered that stories about children who seem almost, but not entirely human, have existed for thousands of years. Long before internet forums and paranormal podcasts, our ancestors warned each other about strangers wearing the faces of innocence. Today, that story grows much larger, because Brian Bethel expected his experience to remain exactly that, his experience. Instead, people from across North America and eventually around the world began telling eerily similar stories. Different cities, different decades, different witnesses, but the same children. By the end of today's episode, we'll examine the astonishing explosion of black-eyed children sightings that followed Brian Bethel's account. We'll uncover the remarkable patterns connecting hundreds of independent reports and explore the strange importance of one recurring detail that appears again and again. They never force their way inside. They always ask. Now, before we continue, I'd like to ask one small favor. If you've been enjoying The New Monsters, please take a moment to follow The Devil Within wherever you're listening right now. Because every follow, every review, every rating helps independent productions like mine expand the audience. And if you're more of a YouTube person, every video is available on our EVO Creative YouTube channel. Now, on with the show. Chapter 1. When one story became hundreds. Urban legends usually spread in predictable ways. Someone claims a friend encountered a hitchhiker who vanished from the backseat of a car. I've done that story a few times, actually. I really like it. But another person insists the same thing happened to a cousin, but it was several states away. A newspaper republishes the account without verifying its origin. Radio hosts repeat the same story because it makes for compelling entertainment. Before long, no one remembers where the tale began, only that everyone seems to know someone who knows someone who experienced it firsthand. Folklorists have spent generations documenting this process, recognizing that legends don't need proof to survive. They survive because the people telling them feel that they're emotionally true. The black-eyed children followed a different path, though. Its point of origin was unusually clear. Brian Bethel attached his own name to the story. He described the location, he described the circumstances, the conversation, and the emotions he experienced with the careful attention to detail that you'd expect from a journalist accustomed to documenting events. Readers knew exactly who was making the claim and exactly when the alleged encounter had taken place. That unusual amount of transparency should have made the legend easier to dismiss. Instead, it seemed to encourage others who had experienced similar encounters to step forward with stories that they'd never before even considered telling. Within months, reports began arriving from across the United States. A couple driving through rural Vermont claimed 2 children approached their vehicle along an isolated road after sunset, politely requesting a ride to a nearby town. A homeowner in Oregon described answering a late-night knock only to find 2 children standing motionless beneath the porch light, asking if they might come inside to use the phone. A convenience store clerk in Oklahoma remembered 2 youngsters entering shortly before closing, behaving with impeccable manners while creating an overwhelming sense of dread among everyone present. Hotel employees, security guards, delivery drivers, and ordinary homeowners contributed accounts that varied in detail while preserving a surprisingly consistent emotional structure. The locations changed, the conversations changed, but the feeling never seemed to change. Witnesses almost universally described the same overwhelming instinct that Brian Bethel had struggled to explain. Before anyone noticed unusual eyes or peculiar behavior, something already felt profoundly wrong. The children appeared outwardly ordinary, yet every conversation carried this undercurrent of urgency that resisted logical explanation. Their speech often sounded oddly formal, almost rehearsed, as though they understood language without fully understanding, conversation. They rarely displayed overt emotion. They just repeated their requests with increasing insistence, maintaining an unsettling politeness that somehow made the encounters more disturbing rather than less. The details accumulated slowly, almost organically. The children frequently appeared in pairs. They often arrived after sunset. Their clothing tended toward ordinary jeans, hoodies, and sneakers, avoiding anything that might immediately attract attention. They almost never attempted physical force. Instead, they requested permission. A ride home, the use of a phone, shelter from the weather, a chance to step inside for only a few moments. Every request sounded reasonable enough that refusing it felt almost cruel. But witnesses consistently described an internal conflict unlike anything they had previously experienced. Compassion urged them toward the door, but instinct urged them away from it. That tension may explain why the legend spread so effectively. The black-eyed children are not frightening because they overpower their victims with violence. They're frightening because they ask decent people to choose between kindness and self-preservation. In that respect, the legend reveals something deeply human. Most horror stories depend upon escaping danger after recognizing it. The black-eyed children present an altogether different challenge. The danger announces itself only after compassion has already begun opening the door. That subtle inversion transforms an ordinary act of generosity into the central source of suspense. As the years passed, the reports became increasingly difficult to categorize. Some remained simple eyewitness accounts shared on paranormal forums. Others reached radio programs devoted to unexplained phenomena, where callers described encounters separated by hundreds of miles, yet connected by incredibly similar details. Skeptics pointed out, quite reasonably, that stories often become more alike after people have already heard the original version. Believers countered that many witnesses insisted they knew nothing about Brian Bethel's account until after their own experiences. Neither side could conclusively prove its case. Yet the legend continued growing because every listener understood the situation. Someone knocks, you answer. And for one terrible moment, your own instincts become the only evidence that you have. Chapter 2. The Invitation. If there's one detail that separates the black-eyed children from nearly every other modern legend, it's not their appearance. No, it's their restraint. For creatures that have inspired such profound fear, they display very little aggression. They don't kick down doors, they don't threaten, they don't shatter windows, they don't chase witnesses through forests or drag victims into abandoned buildings. Again and again, the accounts describe the same peculiar ritual. The children arrive, they ask permission, they wait. The encounter becomes an unsettling conversation in which the witness, rather than the visitor, controls what happens next. The choice always belongs to the person standing on the safe side of the threshold. And that detail is far too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Across hundreds of years of folklore, thresholds have occupied a uniquely sacred place in the human imagination. The Romans worshipped Janus, the god of gates, doorways, and transitions, believing every entrance represented more than a physical opening. It marked the boundary between one state of existence and another. Medieval Europeans nailed horseshoes above their doors, hung sprigs of rowan wood beside windows, and whispered blessings before crossing unfamiliar thresholds because they believed evil required permission to enter spaces claimed by human life. Think of Dante and Beatrice at the threshold of paradise. Or in Jewish tradition, the mezuzah marked a doorway not merely as decoration, but as declaration that the home beyond belonged to God. Countless indigenous cultures treated the entrance to a dwelling as spiritually significant, recognizing that every home represented an ordered world separated from the uncertainty waiting outside. The door, well, it's always been more than a door. It's a line. One side belongs to the familiar, the other belongs to possibility. And maybe no creature embodies that idea more clearly than the vampire. Popular culture remembers Dracula for his cape, his fangs, the nocturnal habits, sleeping in a coffin. But one of the oldest and most persistent elements of vampire folklore rarely receives the attention it deserves, but you see it in almost every vampire movie. A vampire cannot simply enter a home. It must first be invited. The invitation does not weaken the vampire's power. It strengthens the symbolism of the story. Evil doesn't merely conquer. Evil persuades. It waits patiently while ordinary people lower their own defenses, convincing themselves that opening the door carries no real consequence. The black-eyed children follow those rules. Again and again, witnesses describe the children becoming strangely insistent whenever permission is withheld. They repeat their requests with unwavering politeness, insisting that they cannot enter unless they're invited. Some ask to use the phone, others claim their parents are nearby. A few explain that they just need to wait inside until someone gets there to give them a ride. The requests remain reasonable enough that the witness begins arguing internally rather than externally. Compassion competes against their instinct. Logic wrestles with intuition. Every additional second spent standing at the threshold increases the pressure to surrender the conversation to ordinary social expectations. That psychological conflict may be the legend's greatest achievement. Most horror stories encourage us to imagine what we would do if confronted by obvious danger. We confidently assure ourselves that we would flee the haunted house. We would ignore the mysterious noise in the basement. We'd refuse to investigate the footsteps echoing through an abandoned building. The black-eyed children remove those comforting certainties because the situation itself appears perfectly ordinary. Imagine explaining to a neighbor that you refused to help two frightened kids because something about them felt wrong. I mean, even hearing those words aloud exposes how difficult such a decision would become. Every social instinct argues against it. Modern psychology offers an interesting perspective on that tension. Human beings depend on rapid judgments that occur beneath conscious awareness. Long before we identify a threat intellectually, our brains begin collecting tiny fragments of information: posture, tone of voice, facial expression, timing, rhythm, eye contact, hesitation. Most of the time, those unconscious calculations remain invisible because nothing unusual follows. Occasionally, however, they produce an unmistakable feeling that something is out of place. Experienced police officers often describe entering a room and immediately sensing danger before identifying its source. Emergency physicians sometimes recognize a critically ill patient moments before laboratory tests confirm their suspicions. Parents frequently awaken seconds before a crying infant makes a sound. Now, these experiences are not supernatural. They're examples of the brain recognizing subtle patterns faster than conscious thought can explain them. Brian Bethel described precisely that sensation. So did many of the witnesses who followed. Their fear arrived before those eyes. The eyes just gave the fear a face. And maybe that explains why skeptics and believers alike continue returning to the black-eyed children. Even those who reject every paranormal explanation often acknowledge the emotional authenticity running through the encounters. Whether the children existed exactly as described matters less than the psychological truth embedded within the stories. Every listener understands what it feels like to ignore an instinct and regret it later. Every listener remembers meeting someone perfectly polite who nevertheless inspired inexplicable discomfort. The legend amplifies that universal experience until it becomes unforgettable. And folklore has always operated this way. The details evolve from century to century while the emotional lesson remains unchanged. Medieval villagers warned each other about strangers emerging from enchanted forests. Victorian families imagined mysterious visitors arriving after sunset. Today, we tell stories about children standing beneath porch lights, illuminated by security cameras and motion detectors, asking for permission to cross a threshold. The scenery changes with each generation because civilization changes. Human nature doesn't, and that continuity reveals something remarkable. The black-eyed children may feel like an internet legend, but the internet merely gave an ancient story a new address. The devil within rarely announces itself through overwhelming force. It understands that persuasion has always accomplished what violence can't. Every civilization eventually discovers that the greatest temptations arrive wearing familiar faces, asking reasonable questions, and appealing to the very qualities that make us human: kindness, compassion, hospitality, and trust. Those are among our finest virtues. They also require us to accept a measure of vulnerability. Without that vulnerability, really, civilization becomes impossible. With it, every knock at the door asks us to make a decision that our ancestors would immediately recognize. Maybe the black-eyed children endure because they remind us that fear has never depended upon certainty. We don't know whether Brian Bethel encountered something genuinely inexplicable on that winter evening in Texas. We can't verify every account that followed, nor can we dismiss every witness who insists they experienced something profoundly unsettling. Somewhere between belief and skepticism lies a more interesting truth. Stories survive because they continue expressing emotions that remain deeply recognizable. Long after the details fade, the feeling remains, lingering in the imagination like footsteps retreating from a front porch after midnight. So the story ends in the next episode. We'll examine the incredible relationship between eyewitness testimony, memory, suggestion, and folklore. We'll ask why so many intelligent, credible people become convinced that they have witnessed extraordinary events, and why modern technology has failed to produce the definitive evidence that many expected. Finally, we'll explore what the black-eyed children reveal about the future of mythology in an age of smartphones, artificial intelligence, and digital certainty. Because the question was never simply whether the children were real. The more interesting question is why they continue knocking. That's next time on The New Monsters from The Devil Within. The Devil Within is an EVO production recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Branden Morgan.